Hi, my name's Steve Winterfeld. I'm the advisory CISO at Akamai. And today I wanted to take some time and just share some of my experience, talk about some of the things I see going on in the industry across our customer bases. And really it's around, how to protect the edge. Traditionally, when I was building a program, and that's what we're going to talk about today is building programs, is I used to think about, the edge facing out my network and then the endpoint. And in today's, multi-infrastructure options, that's actually becoming dated. I have some customers that everything is almost on the edge. And so I want to talk through how to secure that edge. I love this quote by Michael Jordan. First of all, it is absolutely a team sport. Everything we do in InfoSec. Second of all, we used to think about going out and getting the best athlete, the best product for each individual capability. And now I've got some customers. I talked to an insurance company the other day with 63, talked to a major bank in England. They have 500, which just blows my mind. And so it's about, getting rid of some of that complexity and moving forward. So let's jump in. I want to start talking about, the concept of really a strategy versus a framework. And I think they're different. Some people will say, the framework is my strategy, and I'll push back on that. So let's say, you go out there, and I know in banking now, resiliency is becoming something the federal auditor is looking at. So let's say I wanted to have a resiliency strategy. Fine, that can mean, a simple definition of ensuring my customers have access to their wealth in a contested environment. And what are the resources? I could move to a CDN so they had, good capacity. I could move to something that prevented a threat like denial of service. I could move to, a cloud infrastructure that could scale and give me more capacity by building more servers. So I think as we think through that, though, then the framework has to come with something that's a little bit different. And that's more around, NIST 800-160 talks about resiliency, or ISO 22301 talks about business continuity and resiliency and security are components within that. So I think those are the frameworks. And I think those are tools we use to get to the strategy. And in fact, one of the things I'll talk about today is we're going to recommend an analyst strategy. And I would be careful, analyst framework, I would be careful calling it a strategy, because then you can be held to by an auditor to doing everything within that framework. If you call it an analytical tool, which is appropriate since it's from an analytical organization, then you can just implement things that are in accordance with your strategy. And so, let's look at some other frameworks real quick here. We've got a number of them. The first is, government-based NIST. The one second at the bottom, MITRE, is semi-government. It's government-sponsored. I'm a huge advocate of the MITRE framework as a way to measure the maturity of your SOC. We've got some over here to the right. HITRUST, similar to PCI, is an external paid-for auditing capability. COBIT is an audit capability framework you can use. And so there are a number of these. We're going to focus today on the two that are edge-based. Forrester's Zero Trust Edge, and SASE, the Secure Access Service Edge. And that actually came out in 2019 in a paper called The Future Network Security is in the Cloud. And if you want access to that paper, you can get it on Akamai or a number of other sites. And Forrester Zero Trust Edge has a great blog that anybody can get to that kind of outlines their thought process. But these are a couple tools I want to focus on, and we're really focused on Gartner's today. I think it's gaining a lot of energy, similar to Forrester Zero Trust 10 years ago. We're still talking about that because it's something the industry was already doing. And I think the SASE framework is just hitting us at a time where it makes sense, because we're already moving in that direction. And then the last one on here is, is something a little bit outside security, but I think we in security should look at those, what is the cost of doing business? What are some of these other frameworks we should be paying attention to? So as we work across the stakeholders and partners, we're talking in the same language. So let's talk about the SASE framework. And I love the saying that name SASE all day as much as you will. And so, it is about the benefits. And so the first thing we want to do is reduce complexity while actually gaining more situational awareness. By being on one platform, you're getting that integration up front. Simple vendor management equation. If I think of that one customer managing 500 vendors, they're spending a lot of their time in vendor management. So if I can cut that number in half, regardless of it is, if I'm a small company with 2 employees and 15 vendors is a lot of vendors. And so if I can cut that down, it just makes life easier for everybody. Staffing. I can't keep increasing my staffing and finding the skills, quite honestly, is making it hard in the first place. And so I want to look at something that, instead of having 4 security tools with one engineer managing 4 and barely being able to keep them patched and optimized, now I have one engineer managing one platform, able to do a much better job. So I think there's some benefits there. And then finally, reducing latency and improving enforcement by collaborating with the network side. And we're going to take a look at that here. So what we have is we have the ability for the framework to include both the network side and the security side. And so what we're looking at, I'll give you an example from my past. It's one of my favorite stories is I had my security architecture done. I had my program in place, and then I found out some of the applications I'm protecting were being moved to a public cloud. And so now I'm scrambling to say, how do I get the controls into this particular cloud? How do I make sure that I'm able to meet my audit requirements? It just sent me into a scramble to protect those because we weren't really tightly integrated with IT. We've all had this experience of being pulled in too late, but this is an effort to kind of get in front of that. And so as you look to the left hand of the screen, you have all those network capabilities, software-defined WAN, content delivery network. On the other side, you have all those security capabilities, cloud security brokers, a secure web gateway, zero trust network access, web and application firewalls, cloud-based firewalls, secure DNS, remote browser isolation. If you look at the broader list, there's probably, between 10 and 15 capabilities listed there that you should think about integrating both sides of this into one platform to get that complete integration. So now let's take a step back. And, we said, okay, we've got a framework. It talks about the edge. How do we define that edge? How are we going to come to consensus on what that looks like? And so what I want to look at here is just the ability for us to say, you can have the edge and still be in the data center. There are some infrastructure, some industries that just make sense to stay in the data center. There are others that are going to go into cloud. They may go into multi-cloud. They may go into private cloud, a mix. And so, what does that look like? And there are others that are moving straight out to the edge. You've heard the term edge compute. If you're thinking about, even if we go back to cloud, you have, infrastructure as a cloud, you have data storage, you have functions or running code snippets, what we call serverless. Some of the serverless are going straight to the edge and they're doing more and more distributed. And so as you think of these different concepts, you have to say, what does edge mean to us? Am I going to, protect the edge, protect the network, protect the endpoint? How am I going to protect the edge? What does that consist of? And so as you get your arms around that, I think that really helps you then be able to say, what are the requirements to secure it? What is the strategy I'm going to go about to do that? And so next, let's kind of say what are some of those architectures that might be involved. And so the first architecture is kind of a content delivery. That was one of those more the edge leaning concepts. And so if you're going into this, what are the threats? How do we deal with that? And how do we build towards this? And so if you have a lot of web-facing capabilities, be they APIs or web pages, this may be a good concept to think about. Now, again, it's not going to be the only thing you think about. There isn't just one architecture. But as you talk to the networking side, this will be part of it. Are they going to use something like content delivery? Are you really worried about denial of service attacks? Again, going back to the example of wealth management, people need to have access to their bank account. And so are you going to focus on, availability being extremely high? And so are you going to do some kind of a scrubbing center or something to mitigate DDoS because that's a high threat? And then, ultimately DNS, so people can find things, so people can find you. How are you going to protect that? How are you going to optimize that? So these are some samples of things for us to think about as we say, we've defined the edge. Now we need to talk about the different architectures involved in the edge. And there's, going back to software-defined WAN, there are other opportunities to have a discussion here. But this is just a sample of the kind of things we should think about. And as we think about those, it's always good to crosswalk those to the threats we're most worried about. And so, first of all, what are you protecting? Kind of mapping to the architecture beforehand as a sample. Then, what is the requirement? Is it performance? Is it just access? What are we concerned about? Or where are we willing to take risk? And then, which infrastructure should we use? So as with everything, I think this is an excellent opportunity to make sure your red team's involved or your penetration test team or your SOC team, whoever's in charge of bringing that threat to the conversation to make sure you're building something that's secure and meeting the needs up front. And so, the next thing we want to talk about is kind of these different models as we tie back to the threat and the architecture and all that is, we now need to go look at what our business model is. Because ultimately, when I talk about the security strategy should be a subset of the business strategy. The security architecture should be a subset of the business model we're going to be using. And so, different industries are doing this differently. We're coming out, some will continue to lean into remote work, but even remote work is different. I mean, we're back to the challenge of somebody being in a hotel or a coffee shop or an airport. And as that starts to happen more and more, I think the traditional challenges of people being at home will expand because now you're on more and more potentially untrusted or compromised networks. And so as we're looking forward to this, are we going to go to what I call more of an location agnostic architecture? Or are we going to stick with our heavy branch? You've got the main office and then you've got bank branches, or you've got these subcomponents that are physical places that you're mirroring your infrastructure. Are we going to stay in this more distributed remote workers and have each worker or each city somehow be a thinner branch and smaller requirements because we're not protecting quite as much depending on how we have them coming in? And then finally, we've got something that is leaning away from this more into cloud architecture. And so you see different security components based on managing risk and your business processes. And so, if you have somebody that is simply doing administrative work, they may need fewer security tools than somebody that's working, a developer on your crown jewel with all your intellectual property. Some of this will be very compliance-based. It may be regionally compliance-based. It may be compliance from the industry or privacy or all sorts of things. So part of this goes back to, how are we matching up to the business model? And then something we need to start leaning into is, what are those Internet of Things we're trying to protect? Where are they coming up? Just the other day, I took my car in, and They were like, have you been here before? Yes. They connected to the car, pulled up everything from diagnostic, my name, all my information, never even asked me who I was, but just focused on interacting with me through the data they pulled off the car. And that data included any alerts that I wasn't aware of that they may want to have called me before or later. And so, what of my information is on that little pad there, the tablet they're using? Is my credit card information in there? Is my personal life information on there? Protecting the customer is suddenly tied to a device that may not have gone through the security review. So what is those Internet of Things that we have to protect? And so just something to think through as we continue to do this crosswalk. So now I want to jump into a group of slides that are really going to be text heavy. The temptation is to read through all the slides, ignore me while I'm talking. But I want to say that, I built these and I built this whole thing for you to be able to go back and look later, to use as a tool, scrape this information, and build a program or use it to take a review of where your program is today. And so there's a lot of text here that you can go back, pull up the slides, and then scrape this information and use it. So we'll dive straight in here to the first one, kind of these factors. If you look at the analyst paper, they have a number of factors that's much longer than this. I wanted to talk to the ones that I think are the most critical. And obviously the holy grail of security is, finding that situational awareness, knowing what's happened real time, the minimize the dwell time of any threats on your network. And so what we have here is, how does this tie into the rest of your system? Is this, a way for you to get visualization and situational awareness rapidly? Defense in depth, obviously, classic. I want to jump into two of these up front, though, and that is really resiliency and segmentation. So everything we've been talking about is consolidation and getting rid of complexity. And here I'm talking about two concepts that say, let's make things more expensive by having multiple capabilities, some kind of a resiliency, and let's do segmentation to make things more complex. And so these are kind of, I'll call it the yin and the yang here to explore how are we going to do this. Redundancy and resiliency are two different things. So it doesn't mean you have to have two of something. It doesn't mean you have to double down. It means it has to be able to, again, work in a contested environment. You have to have components of your network and security capabilities that are going to respond real time, ideally in an automated, safe way, to ensure that access or connectivity or whatever your business model is. And so just need to think about that up front so you don't take away some of what we're trying to build towards. And then segmentation. The classic is VPNs. Segmenting VPNs is great because you reduce your risk. We talk about upfront that zero trust network access. Typically, there are two ways to approach that: microsegmentation or network layer access. Going straight into the application. Benefits to both of those. But as you talk through this, having done this, when you have an auditor come in and you say, well, I have that segmented, then they want evidence of segmentation, and then somebody does segmentation wrong and you have data spillage. And so worth considering how to minimize this, how to take things out of scope where you can as a technique to minimize what you have to segment, and just think through how to not lose some of the benefits you've gained. And then the last one I'll emphasize on this is staffing. I'd like to work with a vendor that can give me engineering expertise on demand, or maybe help me search for a project that I need extra help with, and then they can fade off after I've accomplished that goal. So, when you think through staffing, both how are you going to minimize your staffing, and as you work with vendors, how are you going to be able to leverage on-demand staffing? Next, I want to give you kind of a checklist of what I think are some of the critical capabilities. Up front, these kind of talk about what the corporation needs to do, the things from the vendor, and then a couple at the end talking about, the future and other considerations to have. So up front, what are my requirements? What's my edge look like? We talked about that. Then here in the middle, it is, what are the services do they offer? Geographically, and this is a huge component for me. What are the compliance requirements? I just need to understand, if you're in the United States for privacy, it's different by state. If you're international, it's different by country. You've got some that are talking about, where data can reside inside or outside the country. You have different definition of what is included in privacy, and so as you work through all of this, you want a vendor that is going to pay attention to that for you, or are you going to take care of that? And this is an example of where we talked about it being a team sport. You may need to pull in the privacy or the legal and get those reviews on what do those requirements actually look like. How mature are they? How are they going to be around? Do they deliver on the roadmap? Is this a company I'm going to be wanting to work with long term? The smaller companies, are they going to be bought by another company and then they fade out? Are they going to, and there's just so many things to think about here in the big picture. And then as we look forward, what are the emerging threats that aren't in the SASE framework? An example I'll use is kind of that JavaScript threat. We have a lot of JavaScript on the edge. The SASE framework, as it comes to you, doesn't really talk about protecting that. And with Magecart threat out there, another concept. So what are those emerging threats? How do I add that in? Again, pulling in your threat team to try to talk through that. And then ultimately it comes down to efficiencies. What is the cost and what is the benefit to my risk portfolio? And so then the next capability I think is for me really important, which is, I always think of as is and to be when I'm building out a program. And so we need to take a hard as is look, and say, what is our current risk radar? What are our audit findings? What do we need to fix? And can, by moving to this new architecture, to this new paradigm, what can I fix that I already know are challenges that I have? And then where are we going? Where's the business going? Where's IT going? What are our transformation goals? A classic one would, we're trying to be cloud first, or we want to go from web-based to application-based, and move more into the mobile app market. Where are things going? Where is our cyber strategy headed? And so as we think through, this program, we want to understand all of those things, because it's easy to build security not tied to the business. It is vital that we go back to understand, are we building out for the business model we're headed to? And then ultimately, you got to look at your technical debt. I've done that where I bought a capability that solved one narrow problem. I'm using 10% of the capability of whatever I purchased, and I never optimized it to use 90%. And if I had used 90% of 3 of the capabilities that I did that with, are there redundancies that I could get rid of with other capabilities? And so, really think, and the worst thing you could do is have a capability that wasn't up to date that would have prevented a breach. Because now in the class action lawsuit, your due diligence isn't there. And so these are just kind of concepts that I think are important to think through and make sure that, our current risk, our technical debt, and our strategy are all tied together so that the program we built is ultimately going to move us forward. And so, the next thing I want to cover is really just kind of how you're going to do this. How you're going to accomplish this. We talk about all those network capabilities on the one side. We talk about all the securities tools on the other side. It's not like you don't have any of those. It's not like you're not doing anything. And so to move into this, you're not going to walk away from that investment. And so you're not going to do this in a year. And even if you're moving into new, like let's say you're going to move into cloud and you want to do this, perhaps you could do it then. But even then, you're not going to find one vendor that does all of this. And so you're going to have to say what's most important. What do I want to start with? Maybe I start with a vendor that has some of these and is going to move into future capabilities. But ultimately, you need to pick a priority to do this. And so without knowing what your gaps and your challenges are, your business model is, generally speaking, this is kind of where you want to start. So the first thing would obviously be you kind of want to start with this zero trust model. And you want to go in here and you want to say, okay, access is number one. And so how are you going to provision access in a way that, if you're moving to location agnostic, how are you going to do it? If people are moving back into the office and they're still going to have more flexibility, how are you going to do that to give them that flexibility to be out of the office when they want? But really, I think so many of the compromises we've seen are from, compromised credentials or people, getting in through some identity path. And so, number one, zero trust. Whatever model you're going to, most important. And the next thing I would think through is, protecting that infrastructure. Last year, we saw a huge spike in both the volume and complexity of DDoS attacks, as well as, attacks against infrastructure, extortion DDoS campaign, one of the largest we've had in the last 5 years. So how are you going to stop that denial of service attacks against your infrastructure or against your DNS? How are you, and then this also, talking about your infrastructure and DNS is where you go back and tie in with your network folks. How are you going to optimize? How are you going to have a joyful experience for your customers and your employees on this? Next, talk about CASB, and this depends on how much you're using that would require, a SaaS CASB solution. If you're not heavily into this, this would be deprioritized. If this is where everything is, then this might move up higher on the list. Secure web gateway just becoming more and more and more important. And this is, preventing those phishing attacks, interrupting certain types of ransomware attacks, just so many areas because of how your employees are interacting. And then firewall and web application or API protection. And this is on the bottom of the list because you probably have this. If you didn't have this, it would be number one. And so over time, some of these, we're just going to replace it when the natural contract expires. Others, we may, have a new concept that we want to move into, just things to think through. But I would really take a look at your overall prioritization as you go through this. And again, I'm talking about the security side. You absolutely need to tie back to the network team and get their buy-in so that we can build together and prioritize together. And so finally, I want to spend some time talking about how to kind of tie all this together. And so you need to sync with the IT team, if I haven't said that before. You want to figure out what the mandated requirements are, what models you want to go through. I've given you a couple analyst frameworks. SASE tends, the way it's written, to be a little bit more focused on protecting the company and your employees, but you can absolutely expand those requirements to protecting your customers, the web application firewall, DDoS. A lot of the things you need to do that are already in there. You just need to expand the scope and the requirements to do that a little bit better. Tie into those key stakeholders, the risk. Is a board going to be involved depending on how important this is? Get those stakeholders buy-in, understand what their requirements are, privacy, legal, fraud, all of those different stakeholders. Look at your as is and your to be. What do you want to get out of this and what do you want to solve with this? get get that get that all done. You may want to do an external assessment of your plan or afterwards, ideally both, and then publish this, go out and make this happen. And so with that, I want to thank you guys for being here, giving me some of your times. Please continue your questions in chat. I'll continue to answer those. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just say, hey, saw you on the RSA talk, wanted to ask a question. If you have something you want in the future, reach out to me however you can. But again, thanks for giving me some of your time. Thanks for sharing this journey with me, and look forward to meeting you in the future.